Well, we're back for more fun with History of the Ancient Near East. I'm your instructor, Justin Singleton. In this first lecture of Week 5, we'll be talking about Egypt in the Middle to Late Bronze Ages. Now, as we're talking about the Middle to Late Bronze Ages, we'll be covering the first of the intermediate periods, or the first period of major decline in Egyptian history. We'll talk about both Heracleopolis and Thebes, and all that relates to those two cities during the period of study. We'll also discuss the Middle Kingdom, including the deification of Mentuhotep, the bureaucracy of the kingdom, the infamous 12th dynasty, and finally, the outsiders who will eventually usher in the second intermediate period. Now, just as a note before we get started with the lecture, my allergies are horrible today, so I'm having to keep pausing the recording so that I can cough and clear my throat. So if it sounds a little bit choppy, forgive me. Egypt at the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age had moved into a sort of Dark Age, referred to as the First Intermediate Period. This occurs around the same time that the Gutians attacked Mesopotamia and Elam, devastating the lands and ending the Akkadian Empire. Just as decline in Mesopotamia led to changes, so decline in Egypt did the same. Deterioration in both Mesopotamia and Egypt at this time was likely, at least partially, linked to the drying phase that occurred all over the northern hemisphere and impacted not only Mesopotamia and Egypt, but other civilizations, including those in Greece and the Indus Valley. With drying comes drought. And drought very often turns hungry citizens against those who keep the granaries. Thus, these climatic changes played a major role in the demise of the Old Kingdom. And with the population in Egypt doubling between 3000 and 2500 BC, and therefore demanding more resources, attempts to revive the kingdom failed, leading to this period of instability. The collapse of the Old Kingdom spanned around 200 years as the kings at Memphis cumulatively lost both wealth and power. Now, the throne was under enormous financial stress, and the dismissal of pyramid building, which obviously was quite costly, did little to relieve the economy. In the later Old Kingdom, as new lands were brought under cultivation, the bureaucracy of the land necessarily expanded, and estates were granted to officials as either remuneration or reward. Now, the transfer of ownership of these lands that once supported the royal and divine cults permitted the state to continue to function for a while, but as political nomes or districts became self-sufficient, taxes owed to the royal treasury diminished, leading the throne deeper into impoverishment. As the Old Kingdom crumbled, nomarchs, a total of 42 officials over individual districts who report directly to the king, began to vie for power. From Memphis continued the 7th and 8th dynasties, but they lost control over much of the kingdom, a rival ruling class emerging at Heracleopolis. As the period did not favor achievements in either architecture or literature, little was known about the final dynasties at Memphis. Beginning with the 9th dynasty, the nomarch Ochthaes I seizes power and rules from Heracleopolis, a city located in Middle Egypt near the Fayum. The early parts of this period are not particularly clear, but with a decentralized government and with catastrophic famines due to low Nile floods, nomarchs did all that they could to keep their nomes alive, including warring with other nomes due to competition of resources because of the population rise and diminishing crops. Now, it appears that at least some were successful, as a thriving culture existed even among the poor in Upper Egypt. Ochthaes I and others legitimately held political power, as they controlled the resources within their districts and supplied their people with needed goods. Later Egyptians spoke of this time as being one of chaos, where the people forsook their gods. But this was likely a justification for the power of the contemporary kings at the time. As Heracleopolis continued to gain more and more control, the Heracleopolis nomarchs adopted a pharaonic or kingly ruling style, thus establishing a second dynasty within Egypt. As the Heracleopolis nome attempted to gain control over the entirety of the kingdom, another nomarch at Thebes began to consolidate power. And with the original Memphis kings being relegated to basically local control only, Egypt was now split into two kingdoms once again. Upper Egypt, centered at Thebes, and Lower Egypt, centered at Heracleopolis. It should be noted that although the 7th and 8th dynasties belonged to Memphis, the 9th and 10th dynasties belonged to Heracleopolis, and the 11th dynasty belongs to Thebes, these may not be consecutive. It would appear that the 8th dynasty, who ruled at Memphis, did so as Heracleopolis waged war on surrounding nomes, and therefore the 9th dynasty at Heracleopolis occurs consecutive to the 8th. The 10th and 11th dynasties ruled somewhat contemporaneously, one in the north and the other in the south. In the south, which is Upper Egypt, wars were also waged, nome against nome. For example, Heracleopolis, a city in Upper Egypt, not to be confused with Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt, captured Edfu in the third nome, and then the army traveled northward to threaten Thebes. Now, these types of battles carried on for about a half a century, until Heracleopolis in the north attempted to control the entirety of Egypt as a new line of pharaohs. Heracleopolis' concern for the south, of which it had no control, but hey, why should that stop them, was to abolish the nomarchs and place the entirety of Upper Egypt under the control of an overseer. The nomarchs in the south resented this, and ultimately many rallied to Thebes as a possible rival to the northern power. Thebes was relatively weaker than Heracleopolis and their allies, which included Asyut in Middle Egypt, and even the before-mentioned Heracleopolis and Edfu to the south of Thebes, thus encircling the nome. In fact, Thebes and Coptus, their ally, lost a major battle against Heracleopolis forces early on in the war. Theban leadership, though, turned to both Nubian and Asiatic mercenaries for help, turning the tides of the war in their favor. Thebes eventually beat the Heracleopolitan alliance in battle, reuniting the land of Egypt under force of arms and initiating the Middle Kingdom period in Egypt. It should be noted that, as with many of the Egyptian dynasties and periods, there's some confusion and debate over what dynasties constitute what periods. There are standard elements throughout Egyptian history. For example, the 4th through 6th dynasties belong to the Old Kingdom. The reunification during the 11th dynasty and the 12th dynasty belong to the Middle Kingdom. And the 18th through 20th dynasties belong to the New Kingdom. The issue is what constitutes the beginning or ending of these periods. For some, the Middle Kingdom spans the latter half of the 11th dynasty, along with both the 12th and 13th dynasties, based on the cultural and political continuity between the 12th and 13th dynasties. For others, the first half of the 13th dynasty is added. For some, only the 12th dynasty belongs to the Middle Kingdom. Now, for the purposes of this study, only the last half of the 11th and the entirety of the 12th will be considered. Thus, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt begins in the middle of the 11th dynasty, when Mentuhotep II of Thebes defeats Heracleopolis and reunifies the nation. Although known only indirectly, the reunification brought about another golden age in Egypt. In order to maintain this prosperity, changes needed to be made. Unfortunately, it's difficult to define the Middle Kingdom. The Old Kingdom had its pyramids, and the New Kingdom has its empire. But the Middle Kingdom was more of a time of transformation. No doubt Mentuhotep II understood that the unifying of the kingdoms would need to be a fight on an ideological front as well as a military one, attempting to win over the populace in order to retain power. The first move that the new king would take was to establish himself as worthy of his position. The king emphasized his lineage, and as most kings did. And he also put in place a program of self-deification. Mentuhotep II claimed the responsibility of major temples within his territory, but he also dedicated statues of himself that would be worshipped. The king portrayed himself as a powerful mortal who had become a god, renaming himself Uniter of the Two Lands. Mentuhotep II spent his reign, after reuniting Egypt, strengthening that unification. He retained many of the nomarchs in the land, though those who could be considered unhelpful would be stripped from their positions. Throughout the remainder of the 11th dynasty, nomarchs continued their traditional role, and much of the government was based on Old Kingdom practices. Overall, Mentuhotep II followed a policy of pacification, attempting to suppress any antagonism between the two former kingdoms. Crown bureaucracy was supported through taxation based on the assessment of yields, and forced labor was practiced, which included both the middle and lower classes to specific tasks, for example, military service. Now, it should be noted that before this time, workers were not slaves, but conscripted as a form of tax, a system carried over from the Old Kingdom. That said, records in the Middle Kingdom show evidence of incursions into the Nile Valley by outsiders, and several households appear to have had foreigners on their staff. Some believe this to be evidence for the keeping of Asiatic slaves, as the Middle Kingdom was the first major period in which slavery was well known to have occurred. Interestingly, it was during the Middle Kingdom that the class system became permeable, allowing for individuals to rise through the social ranks to positions of power. For example, from the lowest of the classes to the highest. Everything changed with the 12th dynasty. After Mentuhotep II came Mentuhotep III and IV, and they had some successes. The renaissance of the Middle Kingdom, though, began with the father of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat I, who usurped the throne and may have been the vizier of Mentuhotep IV. The 12th dynasty rulers showed a pious regard for the preceding dynasty, whom they usurped, including the continuing of building statues of the 11th dynasty kings. After some years attempting to rule from Thebes, following 11th dynasty practices, Amenemhat I moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to the newly formed city of Ichtawi. Artistic innovations were made, including more realistic sculptures that appeared more like portraits than romanticized concepts of the kings. Additionally, Sphinx images begin in this period, including the Great Sphinx, dramatically suggesting the pharaoh as a protector. Literature also expanded, with such tales as the story of Senui, temporary exile in Canaan, being written in this period. These new heights in literature, as well as architecture and religion, no doubt were stimulated by the growth of the scribal sector and of the middle class in Egyptian society. Interestingly, Middle Kingdom authors appear to set many of their stories in the Old Kingdom. But this reconstruction of the Old Kingdom must be held in suspect by historians today. Because of the greater sophistication of the 12th dynasty, some believe the Middle Kingdom to only truly begin at this point. The dynasty was prosperous and included monumental building projects once again, such as tombs for the kings and regional governors. Though Mentuhotep III and IV of the 11th dynasty did a little in this way, it wasn't until Senuseret III that the Middle Kingdom reached its apex. Senuseret III became the most important king of the 12th dynasty, successfully conquering Nubia, instituting administrative reforms, and ending the semi-independence of the nomarchs. He secured major trade routes in Africa, bringing more wealth to the nation, and he continued trade in the southern Levant that had picked up during the Middle Kingdom. It's important to note that from the end of the Old Kingdom, Levantine pastoralists had been slowly infiltrating the Nile Delta, and by the 10th dynasty, these Asiatics occupied both the delta and the east bank of the Nile, well into Middle Egypt. During the Middle Kingdom prosperity, more mobile pastoralists from the Levant gradually moved into Egypt, especially at Avaris. Records suggest that some of these foreign peoples may have been itinerant craftsmen, but as a whole, they became increasingly detached from Egyptian rule. As early as Amenemhat I, these Asiatics had been a problem, the king considering them as foes. And the Middle Kingdom fortress called Walls of the Ruler was built in the northeastern delta to stop Asiatic incursions into the land. Now, this is not to say that the Egyptians went to war with the East. They instead developed both diplomatic and trade relations with Syria and Palestine. Instead, the rulers of the 12th dynasty feared what the Asiatic outsiders could and eventually did become: a threat to Egyptian culture.